Will you give me a go ahead when you're ready for me?
Yes, sir. We are all set.
Alrighty. Good evening, everyone, and welcome to Council's first town hall on reimagining public safety. As a part of Council's Reimagining Safety Initiative, Council is holding 6 town halls to hear from national experts and residents. This, in addition to focus groups and a community survey, will help inform Council as we head towards passing an operating budget in February. Tonight, we'll be talking about establishing alternative crisis response models. For decades, we've asked law enforcement to handle mental health, substance abuse, homelessness, poverty, violent crime, property damage, and more. And that's a lot for one profession and one person to handle. 911 call data reveals that much of what our officers are asked to deal with are problems they may not have the exact tools to solve. In 2019 in Columbus, there were more than 14,000 calls for suicide and mental health disturbances, and more than 11,000 more calls for wellness checks. Tonight, we're going to hear about specialized crisis response divisions, how they can deliver the right response at the right time while freeing up our sworn officers to focus on instances that do require the attention of armed law enforcement. We're lucky enough to have some great guest speakers with us this evening who are experts in this arena. First, we have Betsy Pearl from the Center for American Progress, where she is the Associate Director for Criminal Justice Reform. We also have Mr. Amos Irwin from the Law Enforcement Action Partnership, where he serves as Program Director. And last and certainly not least, we have Assistant Chief Tom Thompson. Mr. Thompson was the former Miamisburg Police Department and now is the Director of Police with the Kettering Health Network. We'll hear a short presentation from our guests. After that, I'll ask some questions and discuss. Then the Saunders Company will lead the audience through an engagement activity to help give audience feedback. And finally, we'll hear from you, the public, during testimony. With that, I'm going to turn it over to our guests to hear a presentation and look forward to a robust conversation.
Thank you very much, Mr. Harden. We appreciate being here. And as you said, right now I am the executive director in a large healthcare organization over policing in Southwest Ohio. I've also been an assistant police chief, retired, and I've been an assistant city manager before. So I understand the importance of what you guys are talking about. And you've already introduced Amos from LEAP and Betsy from the Center for American Progress, and I appreciate that. I want to get to the panelists as soon as possible, but this issue as an officer and also for me as a member of the community is personal. We're here because of what our officers, including myself, have experienced firsthand. And to get started, I'll give you a couple examples of where police are not the best response. The vast majority of our officers have been part of or witness to at least one encounter with a person suffering from a mental health disorder that ended up in a use of force, up to including serious physical harm or criminal charges and incarceration, all of which could have been avoided by sending an appropriate responder. And if you think about the vast majority of our officers having witnessed or experienced that, you think across the country, that is an enormous amount of harm to our society. Mr. Harden, you gave some numbers in Columbus alone. The fact of the matter is an 8-hour mental health first aid class or the 40-hour CIT class does not adequately equip our officers to intervene in a mental health crisis. If you need confirmation from anything I'm saying, I just recommend you just ask any officer and they'll confirm that. Also, another type of situation, I've personally responded to civil complaints or code violations that could have been used more appropriately have been responded to by non-uniformed individuals. For example, I remember as an officer handling a parking issue in which the neighbor parked in front of the complainant's home. By the time I was done speaking with both parties, the call took upwards of about an hour of which time I could have been actively patrolling my beat or building relationships in my beat. Furthermore, according to the complainant, I got the parting shot as I left, as many officers do. The police don't do anything when you call, so why call? That's a big deal because that not only damages officers' credibility, but it also damages the accessibility to officers when an investigation into criminal matters is necessary. So I'll pass it on to Betsy.
Thank you so much. I think we've all heard that every officer has a story of a call that they've been sent to that they really shouldn't have been. We hear so much about law enforcement being dispatched to scenes that they aren't the most appropriate response. These stories, they really do play out in the data. So as part of a report that we published, the Center for American Progress and the Law Enforcement Action Partnership back in the fall, we did an in-depth analysis of 911 calls for service data from 8 cities where that data was publicly available. So what we did was we took a look at the volume of different types of 911 calls over the course of a full year, 2019, to understand what it is that really makes up the bulk of those calls. And so what we found was that really a relatively small percentage of 911 calls are actually considered high priority. So the urgent calls that require, a really immediate response, like when a call is about a crime that's currently in progress. Instead, most of the calls are for low priority issues or medium priority issues. A good example is Seattle, Washington, a city that's slightly smaller population-wise than Columbus. But so in Seattle, we found that 45% of all 911 calls in the year 2019 were considered low priority calls, and only 18% were considered high priority. And when we looked at other cities, we saw a fairly similar distribution across their data as well. So what do we mean by a low priority call exactly? Really, every city codes their 911 calls a little bit differently. Unfortunately, there's no common coding or parlance across jurisdictions. So the call types might have a different name in Columbus than they do in Seattle or in Detroit or Minneapolis. But really, regardless of the terminology, we saw common threads in the types of calls that police are really spending their time on that they don't necessarily need to be or shouldn't necessarily be. So for example, we saw that law enforcement officers are spending a lot of their time on low priority calls that are about disturbances. So that's a really broad category of incidents that could include everything from disorderly conduct to vandalism to a family dispute. We saw in Detroit, those disturbance calls made up almost 15% of all 911 calls in a single year. And some of the other common low priority calls that are taking up a lot of police time are, around noise complaints, calls for an intoxicated person or a person who is experiencing mental health crises, conducting welfare checks, and other non-criminal concerns that the police really aren't the most appropriate response to. And so with that, I will turn it over to my colleague, Amos.
Thanks so much, Betsy. So we wanted to look at places around the country that have an alternate approach to the types of calls, disturbance, mental health crisis, suspicious person, the types of calls that Betsy was just talking about. And the leading example is Eugene, Oregon, where they've been operating a program like this for 30 years. And basically what happens is if you call 911, you can be connected to what's called the Cahoots program, and they send, there's a behavioral health clinician and a EMT, basically, who show up to the scene in a van. And so it's not a police car, there's no police co-responder that's part of the response. And they're able to handle these issues, whether it's mental health, homelessness, addiction related, or other, community issue, and really provide a tailored approach. They're trained specifically for this, and just take that off of the police's shoulders. More recently, this program has been basically adopted in Olympia, Washington, and Denver, Colorado. And in both of those places, in Olympia, it's been operational for about 1.5 years, and in Denver for 6 months. So relatively recent, but they've shown that this can be done in other communities. And many cities now are jumping on board. So San Francisco just rolled out one of these programs, and many other cities are just doing it sort of as we speak. So this is a very important topic of, okay, we want to be able to send someone else to 911 calls so that there's an in-person response that doesn't involve police. And I'm happy to dive more into the details, but I did want to focus on one question in particular and turn it back to Tom, because there's one question that really, whether it's police or community members, people come back with over and over, which is, is it safe to send somebody who's not armed, who's not a police officer, to these calls? How would you respond to that?
That's a fantastic question. And that's one that, as city council, you're going to get some pushback on from your police department as well. Isn't it too dangerous to go to some of these calls without a gun? All we know is the data we see. In Eugene, Oregon, or the Cahoots program that Amos had spoken about, it's been operating for 30 years and never had a single casualty or injury or even close call for a civilian responder. Olympia and Denver have been operating their programs for less time, but they've had zero safety issues as well. And why is that? Sometimes it's a law enforcement uniform and badge that often escalates a situation. I'm sure it's similar in Columbus. It's everywhere. Community responders are trained. People don't wing it. They just don't send people out there. They're trained. And when a situation is different than expected, which sometimes they can be on dispatches, or if it escalates, they always have the opportunity to step back, create space, and use a police radio to get police help. But how often does that happen actually in real life? Fewer than 1% of the calls in Eugene, Oregon get referred to the police. And Denver has been operating for over 6 months without calling the police for backup even once. So not often. So, dispatching is used as critical thought and how to dispatch these responders to calls. And everyone here in attendance recognizes that calls for service that actually necessitate a firearm are really the exception and not the rule. Amos, I'll turn it back over to you.
Yeah. Thank you, Tom. Well, the last thing I wanted to say, and then I'll give it back to you just to close out, is that we looked at data that was publicly available from 8 cities around the country, and we've looked at more since we did the report, but found that between 20 and 37% of all police calls for service, we estimate could be handled by these, what we call community responders, so civilian responders. So, between a fifth and a third or more of all of the police calls. So this is a tremendous share of calls, and it's something we believe has great potential to take things off the police's shoulders. And we're always happy to dive into the data more of how that works. So Tom, I'll just turn it back to you.
Thank you, Amos. Before I open it up for questions, I'll say that LEAP and CAP, Amos and Betsy's organizations, we want this conversation to continue. We're engaging in cities across the country individually to provide customized analysis and recommendations. And we're happy to provide city-specific advice for Columbus as well. So now we're looking forward to hearing any questions that you may have.
Thank you, Chief Thompson, to Betsy and to Amos. I see my colleague, Councilmember Remy, who has been a good partner on our reforms, safety reforms here in Columbus, has joined us as well. And I hope that he has some questions. But I certainly have some. And I'll kick off. I'll ask a couple, and then I'll throw it to you, Remy, and you can ask some. I can throw it back to me, and I can ask the remainder of mine. One of my first questions is, we, through the National League of Cities, I met with the folks in Oregon, Eugene, and talked to the folks from Cahoots. It's been around for 30 years, but before this year, I've been on council for 6 years. I'd never heard of this type of a model. Why has this not had larger adoption than just now? Can we talk about the birth of this idea of alternative response and why it hasn't yet populated itself throughout communities?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. And I think we've really seen a real push both among the public and among elected officials following this summer with the murder of George Floyd to really reconsider the way that we dispatch police and what kinds of roles we want police to fill. And as people are really starting to talk more around the country, and the conversation about reimagining the role of police has really come into the mainstream dialogue. We have seen a little bit more interest in innovating and really looking to some of the places that have started this work, like Eugene long ago. And so I think that, while it's really only starting in the past, 6 months, a year, coming to cities and to conversations across the country, it has been going on quietly for decades, as you mentioned. This is just kind of a fertile ground in this moment as the country really starts to kind of reckon with the history of policing and where the police will go from here.
Thank you, Betsy. As we, so Ms. Gail Saunders and the Saunders Company has been and are currently have a survey out with our community. She told me this evening that we've already had more than 2,300 responses to that survey, and it's asking questions about what our community would feel comfortable, what events would our community feel comfortable with a non-sworn officer responding to. In the end of the day, who really makes that call as cities develop this? And truthfully, I mean, a question that I kind of think about as a strong supporter of this model is who has the liability if something goes wrong? And are there liability issues for cities as we go down this track?
Thank you very much for that question. It's a very important one. So there are a variety of models in exactly how the dispatch works and who makes the decision. In some places, the decision is done by basically the call taker, the person who picks up the phone call, will make the decision, and the police dispatcher is the one who actually relays it to the civilian team, which is on the police radio system. So it's just a part of the normal police dispatch process. That requires retraining the call takers so that they are aware, for example, okay, if the call type is police assist, well, we want to make sure there's no weapons or, serious injuries involved. And then it should be okay for this team. Like, what are the kind of questions that you would ask to try to screen things out? So that's one sort of model, is sort of the police dispatch approach. And then the other model is to have an embedded clinician. This is what Austin is doing, and Houston has a similar program where there is a, let's say, behavioral health clinician or a mental health clinician sitting on the call center floor who is able to get the call transferred to them so they can make the decision. So it's less about retraining everybody already in the call center and just adding a new person with this specific expertise. So I see a lot of benefits in the embedded clinician model, but there are examples of both types. And I think that ultimately, there haven't been any issues with liability, which is, it's not something that you can say for police response. Obviously, there's been enormous issues with liability, but the existing programs have never had anything to try to deal with in a negative light. So that I'm not aware of any sort of liability challenges that have put these dispatch systems to the test.
So, Mr. Harden, if I can add real quickly, as someone who's been a director over some large organizations and in city management before, ultimately it's the responsibility of the city leaders and the leaders in the department to, they're ultimately, liability is going to fall back on them, but they get the wonderful opportunity of having programs like in Cahoots, Oregon and in Denver that are already pre-set up, that have already worked through these liability issues and have been able to set up processes and procedures and training to mitigate that liability. And as you can see, in those cities, there's really been zero harm done to civilians that have been responding, and it's had a very positive impact in all those communities. So fortunately for Columbus, making the decision is a big deal, but you have models that have already worked through that process, and that's really that's really a benefit.
Thank you. Councilman Remy.
Thank you so much. Appreciate the opportunity to be here tonight. This is obviously very extremely good information. I think one of our greatest opportunities is with the call taker, and as I've explored it more and more with our departments, you know, I talked to both of our chiefs, Chief Happ and Chief Quinlan, about we got to bring our call center into a 21st century call center. They currently don't speak the same language. They use different codes for the same, you know, run. And, you know, fire tends to be very specialized, takes 30 to 40, probably about 30% of the calls that come in. And then police takes the full amount. So Amos, when you brought that up, it kind of, you know, it really resonated with me. But I think that their ability to decipher where these calls should, you know, kind of, you know, orchestrate where these calls should go is very important. I say all that to talk about, you know, the decades worth of, you know, kind of the way that cops believe today. And, you know, I think most of us had read through or kind of skimmed through The Rise of the Warrior Cop about, you know, policing in America. And they, you know, if I talk to any of my officers, our patrol officers today, they are going to tell me that it's too dangerous. This isn't going to work. You know, their mindset is such that this is setting up for failure. So how do we get past those stigmas? What do we do to, you know, try to convince our officers that, you know, this is alleviating some of the social work that you've been doing over the, you know, over your career, and putting it in the hands of experts rather than making you deal with social issues instead of doing the police work that you really are necessary to do?
I can start by answering that. And as I said in our presentation, you're going to get pushback from police officers. And I've been a part of in-car cameras. I've been a part of body cams. I've been part of Narcan being distributed. And anytime something community-oriented policing, anytime there's a new phase, everybody wants to throw officer safety on the pile and say this is going to hurt people. Really, here the numbers don't bear that out. And so I would say two things. One, actually three. One, I would make sure I emphasize where these programs are throughout the country and what the data says. You know, is that really truly a concern? Second of all, I think it is so very important that your leadership from the chief on down really embrace this model and embrace this new culture, because this is a different culture of policing. And I think from the top down, modeling it themselves and holding every level of supervision underneath them accountable for living this new culture. And I think they're going to find out that like other things that have come along, there's always a lot of angst to start with, but they end up finding out that it is much easier. So I would ask those officers, though, I would ask them, because I guarantee you, and I'll be very transparent, that behind closed doors, every officer is going to calls frequently where they're looking at each other saying, we shouldn't be taking this call. We have no business being on this call. And those are the calls we're talking about right here, whether it's mental health related, where they don't know what to do and someone ends up getting arrested that shouldn't be, or whether it's some of these civil disputes or, you know, cops want to be cops, you know, giving them the encouragement that says, we're going to open you up to use your skill set to make our community safer. So you get to focus on extra patrol. You get to focus on building those relationships in the community versus being tied up for hours every day on calls that you yourself are saying, we shouldn't be doing this. So they know behind the scenes that there's plenty of these calls we're talking about are calls that that they don't want to be on in the first place. But I had a police officer one time tell me that police officers, they hate change and they hate the way things are. So I think that's just us as human beings, you know. When something new gets presented, it makes us uncomfortable. But I think the biggest key factor is your leadership and your chief staff and them holding that accountability and really funneling that culture throughout their troops. I think that'll be number one.
Just to tack onto that excellent explanation, Tom, I wanted to say that, so I spoke to Chief Ronnie Roberts. He was a officer in Eugene when they initially implemented the program back in '89. He served there for many years, and then he became the chief in Olympia and founded the program in Olympia because he saw how much it was needed, and he had seen it himself as an officer. And he said both times, when it was implemented originally in Eugene and then when he brought it to Olympia, you know, yes, there was pushback at the beginning, but he said it did not take very long. It only took 1 or 2 calls where officers saw, wait a minute, I don't have to deal with this, you know, this person that it's a call that I dread, and I can't really deal with this person. I don't want to deal with this person. It makes me want to just duck down an alley and pretend I didn't see it. And someone else can step in and handle this and handle it better than I would. That's amazing. I love this. And so, you know, he said it quickly turned to officers saying, you know, wait, can we get more of these vans on the street? Can they work expanded hours? So that, you know, it doesn't take long once people actually see it in practice.
I know Chief Happ, our fire chief, has talked about putting a medic with a police officer in the precincts, and certainly, you know, that's a little forward thinking for us in Columbus. So, you know, we're going to continue to explore that way, you know, down that path. I am curious on the data that you looked at. Was that, and I have my assistants with me here. With the data that you looked at, was that based on the results of dispatch, or was that based on the results of the run? So in other words, did you look at it further than just, you know, the initial call? Did you look at the outcome?
Right. So it doesn't include the information on the disposition of the call. So whether the call led to an arrest or anything, that's another layer of analysis that just wasn't available. However, ultimately, the question is, you have limited information coming in. So on the front end, you know, based on how the calls were categorized coming in, what do we think, you know, which runs are going to be able to be handled? And we don't have the benefit of the hindsight to say, oh, this run, you know, here's how it ended up, so we could have sent the responder. Well, unfortunately, a lot of times you don't have the information on how the run's going to end up when you're trying to decide about who to send. But it would be an additional layer of valuable information to have the disposition as well. I agree.
And I will say it's data analysis that we certainly could do if we had those data points. The analysis that we did for the report was simply based on where we were able to get open data sources, and the quality and variable types available publicly are not always, you know, as robust as we would want. Being able to take a look at it from a dispatch and a disposition point is something we could certainly do, though.
Thank you. I'm out of questions for the moment, but I'll send it back to Council President, and then I'm sure others will pop up as we go along.
Thank you. I still have more questions, so yeah, we'll jump back in it. This could go for anyone. So this concept is not entirely new in Columbus. We have a very, very tiny co-responder operation that's happening right now. It is a pilot program, and we're actually very proud of it. I think it is what gives us the basis to further this conversation because of its success rate. And I think and its success rate is that when these folks go out, they arrest 90% less of the time. They actually and so we have that data already. Can someone talk us through the cities that are starting this or scaling this up? How does it work? Do they start with these co-responders and teach the community what this means, and then they go to a non-officer responder? Do they start with a quasi both? Do we need quasi both? Like, how do you start one of these programs and get it to where it is a fully functioning, comprehensive alternative response crisis response unit?
That's a great question. I will take the first crack at it. So obviously in Eugene, this has been around for a long time, but in other cities, how are they approaching it? I think Denver is a great comparator because they had a smaller co-responder program already in action, and the people involved in Denver really credit that with how successful the pilot civilian responder program has been, because it basically built off of that existing relationship. So, the provider, mental health, it was the Mental Health Center of Denver, they were contracted with the police department to do co-responders, so there were already some relationships there. And when, they went with the same company to do the, to do the civilian response, and that just worked very smoothly. So building on infrastructure, it's in no ways, a replacement for co-responders. That Denver is now doing even more. They have even more co-responder teams on the street as well. One of the things that you see in the data, of course, is that even with cities that have very robust co-responder teams, they're still a huge, they're only reaching a small percentage of the calls that would be applicable. So there's always room for expanding the co-responder teams, but the civilian teams have really built on the success of the co-responders, I would say.
And I think another... Oh, sorry, go ahead, Chief Thompson.
I was going to say regionally, the Dayton, Ohio area, Dayton, the city of Dayton has been using for a handful of years now co-responders, and they've actually built that program out. And I think that's really inspired them. I think like Columbus, where you're seeing success, that's inspired them to expand theirs into an alternate response model that will include civilian responders. And also some of the suburbs, or the Montgomery County Sheriff's Department, some of the suburbs around Dayton have started to stick their toes in the water with that co-responder model, and they're finding out that it's very, very successful.
And I was just going to jump in and say that I think it's important also to know that when you move towards this alternative response model, you can, and you probably should, take it as sort of a pilot to begin with as well, focusing on a smaller geographic area, much in the way that perhaps you're doing with a co-responder model. And really getting your footing under you in a smaller particular area of your jurisdiction that is maybe high need, and using that to be able to really track the data in that specific geography on outcomes with regards to arrests, with emergency room uptake, service provision, and being able to compare that to jurisdiction or to geographies within your jurisdiction that don't have an alternative responder makes for kind of a nice natural comparison for an evaluation, and can really make the case that that the alternative responder model is producing really strong results, or maybe needs to be tweaked. But it's a really great way to be able to get a sense of how the program is working, to be able to isolate it to a particular geography at first, as you start to scale up.
Thank you. Are there, so I have met this in the past year in 2020 with both Eugene, Oregon and Cahoots, as well as Albuquerque, New Mexico, who's also, and I thought they were interesting for our city to meet with, because they started their process last year and were working quickly to roll out a process by the end of the year, or they were working quickly. It was new to them as well. But there were two different models. If I remember correctly, Cahoots was mostly external, the city contracting with this external organization to do this work, versus Eugene, which was much more internal, much more looking at like firefighters potentially who could be reassigned to do different responses versus police officers. Is there and maybe if you guys even know more about the two, if I did not explain that correctly, I'd be open um, for cleaning that up. But my question is there advice or suggestions regarding internal versus external?
Yeah, I'm happy to take the first stab at that. So there's really no right or wrong approach. Some cities, as you mentioned, like Albuquerque, have elected to create an entirely new department and really bring the civilian first responders into the government as kind of a government entity, but kind of starting from a new agency. So they've got their Albuquerque Community Safety Department. And the great thing about that approach is that you can kind of build an agency from scratch, sort of really tailored to the needs of your civilian first responder program. Whereas there's places like San Francisco where they've elected to embed their civilian first response within existing city agencies. In San Francisco, it's their fire department, I believe. So again, there's really no right or wrong approach. But if you are considering it embedding within an existing city agency, we do caution to be very careful how you consider how that existing city agencies establish history and their reputation can impact the way that an alternative responder might be perceived by the community. If they're installed in a city agency that has baggage with the community, that baggage is going to carry over into your new program. And so depending on the circumstances and the history in the community, you do want to be very aware of where you're embedding a new program. And I think that particularly goes with the police department. We've seen that Olympia, Washington, a model we've mentioned a couple times, they have embedded their civilian first responders within their police department. And they've had quite a bit of success. Their work is really very impressive. But they will tell you themselves that it takes a certain amount of additional effort to win over people's trust for the program if it's affiliated so closely with the police department, because a lot of the people that they work with and the calls that they respond to are for people who are unhoused or have behavioral health disorders and may distrust the police and feel a little less likely to engage with an alternative first responder at first. And then the other model that you mentioned is the Cahoots model, where they contract out with a community-based nonprofit. In Eugene's case, it's the Whitebird Clinic, and the clinic employs the first responders themselves rather than employing within the government. And there's definitely pluses and minuses to this approach, as with all the other ones. On the plus side, a community-based group might already have the trust of residents and can kind of jump right into the work without having to build that relationship from scratch. And nonprofits also tend to have a little bit more flexibility in terms of their ability to spend funds. But on the minus side, it can be a little, there may be detriment for the responders themselves, since nonprofit salaries and benefits and job stability are often not as great as a government job. Embedding within the government can be a more positive employment situation for the responders, which can allow you to attract better talent as well. So in any case, there really is no right or wrong way to do it. It's very much dependent on what the infrastructure of community-based organizations in your community is, what the capacity and the history of your city agencies are. And it really, there's pluses and minuses to all of the approaches, and it really is kind of a local level decision.
What role does cultural competency play in in response in general? A person who is a mental health expert who is not comfortable or not engaged in certain communities, couldn't one argue that they could have some of the same biases and issues that an officer who maybe comes from outside of a certain community may have as well? Is cultural competency a key pillar to any of this work?
Absolutely. I think you're absolutely right about that. One of the things that we very strongly recommend is around the qualifications and the type of individual that you want to hire into this role. It's a very specific it's a very specific job description. It's a very just specific type of person. We recommend that it's not just necessarily a behavioral health clinician that you want to send out. You also want to engage a peer navigator, someone who has the experience with the issues that the clients are facing and can really relate to those people, from a place of personal experience. We also strongly recommend that the that the folks that you hire into these roles have both experience in the community and a certain degree of credibility within the community. I think that's an incredibly important part of this work, is making sure that you're hiring very specific qualifications that really do lend that credibility and that trust, and in a lot of ways that personal connection and experience to the experiences of people for whom these calls are about. And I will also look to Amos and Chief Thompson to weigh in.
Yeah, I will just shoot you really straight, Mr. Harden. By the way, Mr. Remy, those are my assistants in the background, so I apologize for that. But Mr. Harden, cultural competency training is sorely lacking in all of public service, to include police departments, big time in police departments. We don't do it right. We haven't been doing it right, and it's an issue. I work in the hospital world now, so I have the ability to see both mental health workers and police officers side by side. And although cultural competency always has the opportunity to be an issue with mental health workers, the difference is this, and this is what I've experienced just personally. They are usually much more educated as far as academically. So they've had a lot more classes and a lot more training in topics that would include history and cultural competency. So to be a social worker here, you have to have a master's degree. Whereas your officer on the street, he might have a high school diploma. So I have seen our social workers and mental health workers do a better job of in the realm of cultural competency of navigating issues, regardless of what their personal feelings are. They're actually trained to be able to navigate all different kinds of all the balls that are up in the air in that crisis at the time. And so they seem to just do a much better job. If you just looked at one-to-one and they show up and they both have cultural competency issues. But that is something I definitely think in police work, and no matter who is your responder, looking at our training models, are we really effective in what we're doing?
What are the Betsy, maybe, or maybe even Chief? What are the educational qualifications for this type of position? What would the job description look like?
So sorry, I can't tell if I'm frozen or.
We can hear you. I can't see you, but I think we're all having a bit of a. But we can hear you really well.
Great.
I can hear you well.
Okay, well then I will keep going. So I think an important piece of this is you need to tailor the job description to what kinds of calls you want the responders to be responding to. So if this is specifically a behavioral health alternative response program, that's going to be a very different job description than if you want to have responders going out for, just sort of run-of-the-mill nuisance quality of life complaints. One of the things we try to make a distinction between is that there are quite a number of calls for service that are behavioral health related, and then there's a certain degree of them that are not behavioral health related, but also still don't need a police officer. So just to start out, it very much does depend on, what kinds of calls they're going to be responding to. The kinds of things that we recommend are, behavioral health clinicians. We talk quite a bit about peer navigators as well. Having people with lived experience is a really valuable asset. We've seen some places use community paramedics, which is a step below in terms of training and qualification, but below an EMT. Amos and Chief Thompson, feel free to jump in. I'm sure I'm missing certain qualifications that we've spoken about.
No, I think that's. I think you got it exactly right. There are, so like in Olympia, it's 2 behavioral health specialists because the state has special rules about EMTs and paramedics, so they did not include them in the team. Whereas in Eugene, they do have a someone with that medical experience on the team. In Albuquerque, actually, they have 2 categories. So for the second type of calls that Betsy mentioned, like noise complaints, even things like communication where there's conflict, like with there's family conflict and someone just needs to deliver a message. For things that are not behavioral health related, they have a group called emergency community responders, and so they'll be focusing more on cultural competency, de-escalation, mediation type of skills, and less on do you have a degree as a clinician or some sort of medical certification.
My last question, one of the things that we talk about in terms of improving police and community relations is the ability to get out the car and to have different types of relations with our neighbors. By reducing the interactions between police and our residents, have we seen our police departments, our cities more intentional about then upping or increasing the engagement, the one-on-one interaction between a police officer and the community, just not for cause? Is my question coming across? I guess I'm asking, by standing up a program, if we're successful, we would be reducing the amount of times that a resident in Columbus would have an armed police officer come to their house. But the truth is, a lot of folks have great experiences with police officers when they come to their homes. Is that part of the conversation? How do you still have those engagements between police officers and community since the relationship is changing and maybe even the exposure level would be changing?
I think as someone who's worked on the street before and supervised individuals on the street, I think it will actually increase the exposure that your officers have with people in the community. They'll be much more free to get out and go door to door, talking to neighbors, get involved in neighborhood watch programs, stop at the park and shoot hoops with the kids. I mean, like I used to do. I mean, you're going to really free them up to be able to do more community policing and be involved in areas like I gave the example of the parking complaint. That parking complaint, that officer had some interaction with the community, but 50% of the people he had interaction with are not going to be happy with the police when he leaves, versus leaving that to someone who is more well trained as a mediator or an unarmed response, and let the officer let them loose out in the community and let them build those relationships in a positive way, in a way that doesn't include enforcement action. So I would think that by taking those type of calls off the officers' plates. It's actually going to free them up. Will they do it? Will they do it? That's a fantastic question. And again, I'll go back to what type of culture is your police chief and your police administrators in Columbus going to build? What are their expectations of how they interact with the community and serve the community? And how do they hold their officers accountable for doing that? So, but I think it would be, for me as an officer, a very positive experience.
That's great. Councilman Remy.
So, it's interesting because in about 10 years ago, we changed the way that we dispatch our police. We have 5 zones and it's kind of like an on-demand system. And although that's officially how we dispatch today, it's actually not how it's practiced. But because of those decisions, and I'm not trying to be critical past leadership, but because of those decisions, community policing became less and less of a focus. In fact, it really became impossible because one day you might be in this precinct and the other you might be in another. To me, the crux of the issue is if we want to get back to community policing, we have to dispatch within a precinct and have those people become familiar, those officers become familiar with the community that they serve. I think this is a fundamental foundation to what, and I'm just asking, do you agree with that? I mean, to me, if you've got a policy that has people moving from zone to zone, how could you possibly expect any type of community relation building to occur? Would you agree?
I agree with that 100%. Matter of fact, I have direct experience with that. Prior to me becoming an assistant police chief in our municipality, guys wanted to switch beats every shift. And we wanted people to know, what are the problems in your beat? What are the needs of the people in your beat? And then I wanted guys to be able to start critically thinking how to problem solve things that were going on in their beat, whether they are criminal issues or not criminal issues, to just raise the level of life enrichment in their community, And so in order to do that, people had to work in that beat. The officers had to know who lived there, what the culture was like in that area, and the people had to know them and get to know and trust them. So really, that is also another, and I don't want to beat this drum too much, but that's an issue, a cultural issue that is easily started and lived through from the police chief of police on down. So yes, I do agree. Now, in a city as large as Columbus, you probably have departments within the police department that can just solely focus their entire day doing community policing efforts. You probably have community police officers, but even for the beat officer to know their neighborhoods, to know what the issues are, to be able to help that neighborhood increase quality of life and have that trust and transparency, and also add cultural competency, understand what those individuals that are living in that neighborhood are going through every day, and get to know them and get to know their struggles, so you can make better decisions as an officer when you happen to have discretion in criminal matters. I think, Mr. Remy, I'm with you. I think it's important that officers work a certain beat for at least a year.
I know, in just talking with a couple of our community leaders in a predominantly African-American area of town, they told stories of when they were younger, they'd have a Friday night, everybody on the street would be out grilling out, and the police would come and people would fix them a plate. And, those are things that, certainly we don't see today. And, you can make a variety of excuses why that happens or why we've gotten away from it. But I think it's important that the goal is set that we get back to that. We also have a program in Columbus called the Community Crime Patrol. And over time, I think many people around the community, the community neighborhoods, really appreciated having these. They wear a uniform that's labeled CCP. They're typically college-age students, pretty good prep, if they do want to go into law enforcement officially. But they go around, and if there's code complaints, they might report those. To me, those types of people are the right type of people to do noise complaints, for instance. In the areas that they serve here in Columbus, again, it's been a program that's been kind of cut over the years. And I think that we ought to think about increasing the funding for that program. But in those areas that they serve, I think people appreciate seeing them walking around and they get to know these people. And so, I'm curious of your opinions on those types of programs, especially when we're talking about those low-level calls like noise complaints.
So essentially, community members, like a neighborhood watch, building a partnership with the police department. I think that's what policing is all about. I think those are very appropriate, especially for noise complaints, fireworks complaints. Things like that, as long as they have the ability to, I think it's important to have the ability to be able to directly communicate with a police officer just in case something's not what they thought it was when they got there. But I think any time that the community and the police can partner together to problem solve is a win-win. And Mr. Harden, when you talk about cultural competencies, I think that comes through, the most effective way of building that, in my experience, has been through building relationships. And once you start to build those relationships with your partners in the community, whether they be citizens or citizens on patrol like that, you get to really start understanding people, and you make decisions that are healthier for that community. So no, I think partnerships are fantastic.
I think that this particular program is ran by the city, but again, the focus has gone away from it. I think it's I'm kind of editorializing here, but I feel like it is something that is important to get back to. I think the closer that we can get any of our police to the community, or preventative measures along those lines. I have a question about, anecdotally, in programs where you've seen police officers working with mental health professionals, is there any anecdotal evidence that they become better police officers? You know what I mean? Like just being around that type of partnership. I know with our REACT program, there's a different mindset between the people involved in our program here locally. I have to believe that these types of partnerships raises the level of, kind of like the psyche of a police officer, for instance. But I wanted to know if there's any anecdotal evidence or real evidence that shares that, thought process.
So I'll give you exact experience that I've had. When I took over at the health network, our police department there was very much segregated from any clinical staff. They wanted to act as police officers. So they would go in, they would exclude mental health workers and nurses whenever somebody was acting out, and there was a lot of force being used that shouldn't have been used. So I went in and I set up measures of accountability, use of force reports, transparency, what we're doing. But the biggest thing that I did was I started really reinforcing collaboration with our mental health workers, because most of the violence that happens in hospitals is with mental health patients or persons that are suffering from addiction. And I said, we have to be a team with them. And as soon as we started working collaboratively together, our officers many times took a step back. So we well over 100% reduction in use of force within the first year, just by shifting the way our paradigm on how we approached these crises, and considering ourselves team members with mental health. And we had 64% reduction at one hospital last year alone. And our staff has now been asked to sit on a panel with the Montgomery County Chiefs and the NAACP. And when I sat down, the NAACP said, the reason we want you here is because your officers hardly ever use force. And we want to know what you guys are doing. And really the truth of the matter is, is building a culture of collaboration, of working with our skilled mental health partners and not rushing in to grab onto somebody right away, leveraging their knowledge, their experience, their education. And so, yeah, the numbers wise in our department, I'd probably say over the last 3 years have dropped a couple 100% in uses of force. For a department our size, which we have 160 officers, we rarely use force now. Where before I came and before we decided to start that partnership and leveraging each other's expertise, we were using force every day. And so the answer is yes. It's not only anecdotal, it works. It works.
When there's a mental health,
I'm
sorry.
No, I know we're getting pressed on time on the community side. I see Miss Gail has some engagement she wants to do with the residents who are on the call. If that's okay. I want to thank the panelists because I think they've given us some amazing information, and we look forward to having you guys back. And if you guys are open, us sending like the question. I still have more questions. I know Councilman Remy has more questions, and my other colleagues having some offline engagement and having you guys back. This is the very beginning of this conversation here in Columbus, and we know there's a lot of education that will have to happen with the community, with council members, with leadership, with the police, and as we go down this road. So we just appreciate your engagement, your willingness to work with Columbus. So thank you. With that, I'm going to turn things over to Gail Saunders and the Saunders Company for her community engagement process.
Thank you so much, President Hardin, Councilman Remy, and the community. Thank you so much. We are excited about the opportunity to partner with Columbus City Council, and they have charged us to make sure that we get surveys out, but also as we're having these conversations, to find a way to have some interaction with the community to talk about what you've just heard and really probe and get some questions from you. So this is your chance to be engaged and to be interactive. First, we're going to ask you to join us by going to menti.com. And so, Angie, I don't know if you are able to include Cheryl, my colleague, so that we can present our Menti exercise. Thank you so much. And so this requires you to either go to a different browser on your computer, get your iPad, your laptop, or even your cell phone out. And this is everyone who is online with us, but also those of you who are joining us through Facebook, Instagram, YouTube. This is your opportunity to be engaged as well. And for those of you who are part of a watch party, we're going to count on you to join us too. So go to www.menti.com. Once you get there, you're going to be asked for a code. And that code that you're going to enter is 9134170. So again, go to menti.com and enter code 9134170. And so we're going to center our questions on the conversation that we've been having around establishing alternative public safety crisis response. And so we're going to go to our first question. We'll ask the question, and then we're going to give you about 90 seconds to respond. And my colleague is going to make sure that all the responses that we receive, you can see them. And so our first question is, after today's conversation and the wonderful information we received from our presenters, how do you define alternative crisis response? And so you can type in a word, you can type in a sentence, but this is your opportunity to begin to share your thoughts about community alternative crisis response. Oh, we see them coming in. Using responders other than police where appropriate. Great. We know we have others. We have quite a few number of people joining us on Facebook, on YouTube. You can join us as well in this exercise. And of course, all of those who are online, wonderful. Thank you. Having social workers, a manner by which non-emergency calls for service, thank you. Differentiation in policing, thank you. Oh, they keep coming in, behavioral health responders. And so, you know, we are capturing all of these responses, and City Council has charged us with making sure as we finalize a report that will be presented to the community, these will be included in there. So engagement with community, alternative responders, behavioral health providers, respond to events without police officer to reduce and solve community problems, faith community support. These are excellent. Thank you. Mental health calls being answered by clinicians, plus police and social workers. Wonderful. Excellent. We have about 30 more seconds before we'll move on to our next question. Filling in the gaps through our social fabrics. Multidisciplinary teams. Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you. Culturally competent responders, and that was part of the conversation tonight as well. Thank you so much. And so we're going to go to our next question, and that is, the city of Columbus should spend more time on blank, on what? To establish crisis response. So what should we spend more time on? Should we spend more time on clinicians, understanding mental health in our community, connecting with young people? Any of those things that come to mind, what should we spend more time on? Oh, urban development, mental health training. Please, we'll give you some more time to continue your responses. Mentoring. We heard from Councilman Remy about the program that used to be in Columbus with the community and police. Jobs. We see that culturally sensitive training again. Implicit bias. Building relationships with youth, all of these. Thank you. Thank you. Keep them coming. Logistics for how to divert appropriate calls away from police. Thank you, community. Thank you. Thank you. We have about 30 more seconds. Those of you who are in the watch parties, we appreciate you participating. Thank you. Service for addiction, non-punitive. Thank you. And so we're going to give you about another minute. Urban development and investment in entrepreneurs. Thank you. And so we're going to move to our next question, and I want to underscore some of the opportunities we have there. So when we talk about, and you've heard it, alternative crisis response, what should the city of Columbus invest in to make Columbus more safe? And so when we think about that, you heard from our presenters the various examples that are occurring across the city, across the nation. City Council hears from residents often about local and national examples. For example, President Hardin mentioned our mobile crisis response unit. We have that initiative that pairs NetCare behavioral health specialists with crisis intervention trained police officers to handle 911 calls regarding mental health. We've talked about the React addiction team, and you're familiar with that. Where we're pairing officers with social workers and others to help address some of these responses. And then we talked quite a bit about the Cahoots program in Eugene, Oregon, and you heard the tremendous success of that program that's been going on for over 30 years in that community. So those are the types of things that we're talking about when we talk about alternative types of crisis responses that we should consider. And we see them coming in. Further investment in MCR, and if someone can also write in what that MCR means for us as part of your response, we would appreciate that. Thank you. Oh, React, we see that. Thank you. We've got about 30 more seconds. Excellent. Oh, evaluating outcomes. Excellent. Thank you. Thank you all for all of your responses. Your thoughts and your voice really does, it lends such a great voice to what this Columbus City Council is working towards. So thank you so much. We see a lot of energy around this, so I'm going to let it go a little longer. Engaging universities to train the workforce for the future. Thank you. Oh yes, thank you. Mobile crisis response, thank you for that. Oh yes, the examples such as we heard today through our wonderful national presenters, thank you. Oh, community-wide competitions to help identify some of those opportunities with rewards. Engaging the arts, and you know, we've seen a wonderful Deliver Black Dreams art collaborative with the City of Columbus and the Greater Columbus Arts Council and the Maroon Arts Group. So just those types of things for consideration. And we keep going. We're 44 responses. We appreciate this. This is excellent. Partners with Adam. We'll give about 10 more seconds. And they keep coming. President Hardin, I'm going to spend a little bit more time here because I can see the numbers keep going up. If you're fine with that, thank you. Thank you. More better reentry programs. Excellent. Our restored citizens, supporting them in some way. Wonderful. Invest in neighborhood development. We keep seeing that consistently as well. And my colleague tells me that that seems to be all that we're getting in. So, oh, I see a couple of more. Wonderful. Ask and you shall receive. Great ideas, and thank you so much. And so at this time, we're going to move to our next question. And this question, you know, we want you to be bold. We want you to be forward thinking. What is your vision for alternative crisis response? What is your vision? What do you hope that we can accomplish together in this community as we reimagine public safety? And I know some of that may have been answered. You may have provided answers in your previous response, but think about that. What is your bold vision? What would you hope Columbus City Council, City of Columbus accomplishes as they continue with this important work? Oh, here we go. Wonderful. I hope that we can save lives. Excellent. These are powerful, powerful. Thank you. Thank you. We will separate apart department with sufficient funding. Children won't be afraid of police. Black people won't be needlessly murdered. Provide a service that everyone feels comfortable and safe calling. Start small and make changes based on facts. We have 30 more seconds for this. Excellent, thank you. Take the violence out of emergency. Oh, what about taking care of citizens after a 911 call, not just during? Some consideration for that. Bold vision. Thank you. And so I think we're just about out of time for this question. We'll go to our next one. I know we have speakers as well this evening. So that concludes our interactive section for this. We captured these. We'll be having each of these for each of our community meetings based upon the theme, the discussion for the evening. Your participation was phenomenal. Thank you so much. Remember, we are taking a survey. President Hardin mentioned that earlier. You can go to the columbus.gov/reimagine safety to take that survey. And if you can share with your family, your friends, your church family, your school family, others to take that survey, we certainly would appreciate that. And with that, President Hardin, I'll turn it back over to you. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Ms. Gail and the Saunders Company. How powerful was that? What I want folks to know who just participated is that your feedback really matters. We are in the middle of planning our operating budget. I have been, as an individual council member, not even as council president, been very clear that in this moment that we have been entrusted with, given this past year with the cost for reform, I believe, this is me specifically, that this idea of alternative response, crisis response, is the key. This is my number one goal. My top goal in reform is giving folks an alternative response option to keep folks safe, so that we have the appropriate response when someone is in need. And so having your feedback tonight has been really invaluable. Please take that survey and then come back for the other sessions that we have over the next 4 weeks as we go through this. We have 4 speakers that are going to speak this evening. The cool thing about what we just saw was we rarely get to hear from everybody who is listening and are participating in our hearings. We just got to hear from just about everyone. But these 4 folks, so I'm going to start with Maggie Callender. Miss Angie, is Maggie Callender on the line?
I am sorry, sir. I do not have Maggie Callender online.
Thank you so much, Miss Angie. How about Stephen David?
Yep, I'm here.
Welcome.
Yeah.
Welcome back to council, Mr. David. Just reminding you have 3 minutes and the floor is yours.
Excellent. Thanks so much, Council President Hardin. We really appreciate your leadership for holding the session today and continuing to push this this idea forward. I think that you're really embracing the moment that we're having right now. For the record, my name's Steve David. I'm a social worker. I live on the south side of Columbus in Marion Village. I'm speaking today on behalf of the Columbus Safety Collective, which is a community think tank dedicated to promoting non-carceral safety interventions in the city. The panel we had today was excellent, so I want to just kind of point to a couple of things that really resonate with me from what the folks said. I know we've been in contact with your office about this. One of the things that I found most resonant was the need to really go big with this idea. And there's so many models out there and so many different ways that folks are doing this. I think from the question of like getting the most and best data, and as well as trying to bring in the most potential calls that this model could address. You know, we often have this conversation around just having appropriate providers for mental health calls, but I think that these folks illustrate there's this whole range of other things that we could be dispatching non-police interventionists for to try and make sure that we're providing proper services to folks and really enhancing safety. The other thing that I did just want to say real quickly is, you know, you brought up this excellent question, like, why are we having this conversation now? And it reminded me of like my entry to this the conversation around non-police intervention was really in 2017 when I was doing some work with an activist group that was doing a listening campaign in some neighborhoods around the city. And I remember specifically a conversation I had with a young man outside the Linden branch of the library, asking him about, you know, what made him feel safe in his neighborhood. And I remember when I asked him this question, like, what makes you feel safe here? And he lifted up his shirt to show me the handgun he had in his waistband with a 30-round magazine. And I had a lovely conversation with this man, and it ended when his 7 or 8-year-old cousin came out of the library and this man went to walk him home. And so that sticks out to me just because there's like so many opportunities here to connect with these issues of safety and connect with our communities in ways that don't happen through our law enforcement interventions. And I know, President Hardin, that the possibilities of this moment are not lost on you. So I really hope that we can use the momentum of this moment to go big and really to leave the city better than we found it, and try and establish something that we can all be proud of. So thanks so much for your leadership, and I look forward to being part of this conversation going forward.
Thank you, Mr. David, for your testimony, and thank you for your engagement and the information that you provided already to our team as we go through this process. The next speaker to come before council is Lucy Ramos. Ms. Angie, is Ms. Ramos with us this evening?
Yes, she is. A moment.
Hi there, good evening.
Good evening. Welcome to council. Just a reminder, you have 3 minutes.
Great, thank you, President Hardin. I'm Lucy Ramos. I'm also a member of Columbus Safety Collective. My colleague Stephen just expressed our sincere, appreciation for this commitment to alternative crisis response. Our team's really committed to kind of unpacking this term alternative crisis response, as we are really pushing for a health-centered crisis response pilot in 2021 that does not by default involve any law enforcement officers to respond to the appropriate calls, which I think this conversation tonight has really demonstrated the opportunities that we have and the data to back that up, and the community buy-in for this type of a pilot. Our group has been connecting with leaders from the public health and mental health space, Columbus Police, and leaders like yourself at City Council, and this proposal is really receiving an overwhelmingly positive response here in our own city. Stakeholders across Columbus are ready to take part in piloting a response program that deploys health experts without the presence of law enforcement in appropriate mental health and substance abuse related crises. Is really the space we've been kind of working in. And this has to be done on a meaningful scale. So I really appreciate Ms. Pearl kind of talked about how we could pilot in a specific geographic area, specific neighborhood, but we also know that we want to be able to measure this, because we share a common vision. We want to reimagine public safety in a meaningful way. So for this pilot to serve as a step toward that vision, it has to be measured. And so the non-police teams will need to respond to enough calls for the pilot to be analyzed for statistically significant insights, and not just, leave us stuck with kind of anecdotal evidence or not enough data to bring actionable insights. So piloting a non-police response program is a broadly supported step in reimagining public safety, as I think was demonstrated with the community conversations that were facilitated this evening by Ms. Saunders. And we think that it really must be implemented swiftly. So right now is the time for the city to commit to resourcing this pilot as the 2021 operating budget is finalized. We can't wait longer for the solution, which we've seen from other cities' implementations will better serve people in crisis and better, enable law enforcement to have capacity to work in spaces where they want to and could better serve our communities. So we look forward to continuing offices as this year's budget is developed and finalized. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Ramos, for again your engagement and the work that you've been doing. I think when I heard from you, you said you've met already with our police department, with our health department, and with a lot of folks in our community. And as you said, there's a lot of overlap and a lot of agreements as we go down this path. So thank you. Let's see, the last speaker to come before council is Ms. Becky Walcott. Is Ms. Becky with us, Ms. Angie?
Yes, she is.
All right. Ms. Becky, you there? Ms. Becky with us?
She is unmuted, sir. We will try to check her connection once again.
Sure.
Ms. Walcott? I'm sorry, sir, we're not getting audio from her. She is listed and has been unmuted, but there's no audio.
All right. Well, hopefully, because of the awesome community engagement process we just went through, her comments were absorbed and will be noted as we move through our reimagining process. So with that, then, it'll bring us to the end of tonight's town hall on reimagining public safety. I want to thank our guest speakers for being with us here tonight and sharing an overwhelming amount of information, a great amount of information. The council staff who have worked so hard on this, and the Saunders Company for helping to set up and run these events today. Certainly want to thank CTV for broadcasting this, and most importantly, I'd like to thank all of you, all our residents who have participated and are along as we reimagine public safety. We have more town halls like this coming down the pike. In fact, tomorrow, January 14th at 5:30, the safety chair, Mitch Brown, will facilitate a conversation with Dr. David Kennedy from the National Network for Safe Communities. They'll be talking about violence prevention. Then on January 21st at 5:30 p.m., Councilmember Dorrance will host a town hall about the implementation of the Civilian Review Board with testimony from the mayor's administration and Asleen Rodriguez, who served on that board. On January 27th, Councilmember Shayla Favor and Priscilla Tyson will talk about crisis response with Sergeant Matt Harris from Mobile Crisis Response Unit, as well as Brian Straw and Michelle Perry from NetCare. On January 28th at 4 p.m., Councilmember Elizabeth Brown will facilitate a session about violence prevention. And finally, to wrap us all up, we will have on February 2nd, Councilmember Remy will host our last town hall on civil service reform.
It's 7 o'clock.
And it's 7 o'clock for recruitment for the Division of Police. So we hope you'll continue to participate in these town halls. Furthermore, we have a community survey that we've talked about a lot this night. Then we'd ask you to go to columbus.gov/reimagine safety and take that form. It directly influences how we move forward with this 2021 budget. Councilman Remy, do you have any closing remarks?
Thank you so much, Council President Harden. I just want to thank our panelists, thank Gail for all of her facilitation this evening, and looking forward to this robust conversation as we move forward. We're doing this purposefully to hear from each and every one of you. Your comments are important. The survey's important, and we're taking all this to heart. And so the more comments that we have, the better it is for all of us, and we learn from it. So thanks again, and wish everybody a great night.
Have a good evening, everyone. Town hall's concluded.